Welcome to the last session of today. A very warm welcome to you all. I'm very glad to see it's nearly a full house because we have fierce competition from our friends next door with Lea Ypi and her best-selling book, Free, that I'm sure many of you have read. So it's wonderful to see that either you've all read the book and you're more interested in our topic, but whatever the case may be, I'm very glad to see you all here. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna, and I head the Europe's Futures program, Ideas for Action, which is a strategic partnership with the Erste Stiftung. And we're very proud of it. We're in the 5th year of the fellowship, and we have two fellows here, OANA POPESCU-ZAMFIR, who was a fellow last year, and Tom de Waal, who is a fellow this year. I will say a few brief introductory words. I shall introduce our speakers, and then we will follow the format of the Vienna Humanities Festival. We will have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then I'll open the floor to you, and I'm sure there will be many questions. Clearly, our title, The Age of Uncertainty, the Zeitenwende, is overshadowing all of the conversations that we're having here this afternoon and tomorrow. And the reason that we have chosen this topic, East of Eden, and of course, Eden meaning the Europe of the European Union. We know that in Eden, not everything is Eden-esque or perfect, but still, it is the model of society that everyone aspires to. It is for no surprise that all the migrants that are moving around the world, the great majority of them want to come here to the European Union. And thus the question that arises in the Europe geographically defined that encompasses obviously the countries that we're also talking about, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and obviously we'll be talking more broadly. There has been, with the Russian invasion and aggression of Ukraine on February 24th, a tectonic moment that has changed everything, just as the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 changed everything. And the world is definitely not the same. And as a consequence of that, the European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen, a former German defense minister, among all other things, declared itself a geopolitical commission when it came into office a few years ago. That word, that adjective, geopolitical or noun, has really taken focus in so many ways with what for most of us, unexpected move by Russia to invade a European country of 44 million people has meant. And as a response, a geopolitical and a geostrategic response of the European Union was to declare on June 23rd of this year Ukraine and Moldova full candidates for membership in the European Union, and Georgia a potential candidate to join. Now, this region of the world has been in the focus. It was part of the democratic movements in the 90s and 2000s, and in particular came into the focus what was and is still called the phenomenon of the colored revolutions. Let's not forget that first in Georgia, and I will skip my country, the former Yugoslavia that no longer exists, that we had a revolution against Milosevic, an electoral revolution that brought him down from power in 2000, but let's leave that to the side and for another occasion. In 2003, we had the Rose Revolution in Georgia that brought a democratic government under Misha Saakashvili to power. Then immediately the year after in Ukraine, we had the Orange Revolution, much studied and written about. It's interesting for those of you who follow to go back to the literature and analysis of that time to see what that meant, and then a subsequent series of other events in other parts of the world. And in Moldova also, a president who was a former policeman came to power and at one moment realized that it was better to slant towards the European Union and put the Russians at bay. And Moldova has gone through ups and downs subsequently to now finally, under Maia Sandu, has a government that is fully pro-European oriented, with a friend of many of ours, Nicu Popescu, who is the foreign minister of that country. It is clear that this is a response to the Russian invasion. It is a courageous and bold move by the European Union to declare these countries candidates or close to candidacy. But we also know that Russia has a foot in all of these countries. In Moldova, it's Transnistria. In Georgia, it is Abkhazia and South Ossetia that have been recognized just in this sham way by Russia, as is done on the Ukrainian territories, as independent countries, not parts of Russia, but independent countries. And of course, in Ukraine, the territories that Russia is currently occupying, starting, of course, with the war that began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and taking the parts of the Donbas region. So very much to talk about the geopolitical and geostrategic implications, about the situations in these countries themselves that are all particular and different, regardless of the fact that there are many similarities, and thus the question about how we go forward, and will the European Union, beyond this, I repeat, extremely important symbolic political decision to make them candidates and send a strong message, this is Europe, and this cannot be occupied, this cannot be a sphere of influence of Russia, how the follow-up will occur. And to speak about this with us today, as I said, our OANA POPESCU-ZAMFIR, who is currently the director of the most prominent think tank in Romania, in Bucharest, Global Focus. She was, among many other things, a state secretary for European Affairs. Several years ago, she was the program director of the Aspen Institute in Romania, a contributor to and editor of Foreign Policy magazine in Romania, and many other prominent newspapers and journals. So welcome, OANA. Very glad to have you with us. And then Tom de Waal, who is author, journalist, analyst, and expert, who worked as a journalist in Moscow for many years for the BBC, The Times, was with the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, their Caucasus editor. He was a senior associate in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and is currently a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, based in London. And if I may add, on another particular note, Tom has just regained his Austrian citizenship. His family hails from Odessa. Maybe he will refer to some of those moments. Part of the family moved to Vienna, engaged in business and banking, and built a lovely palace at the Schottenring, at the Schottentor, called the Aphrosi Palace, that some of you probably pass by every day, not knowing that it belonged to Tom's family. We had the luck the other day of having a visit to this lovely palace of Vienna. So history has ways of coming round and back, so maybe there's hope for all of the situation that we're going through. But let me, without further ado, start with you, OANA. Romania is a frontline country, and among all other things that are going on, this is probably the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. There are 6 million people on the move, and we talk of all of these aspects of the Russian invasion. but simply this refugee issue has, obviously we know all about it, the numbers of people that have entered Poland, your country, Slovakia, Moldova, Bulgaria. Can you say something about that and the way that your country, as a frontline European Union and NATO country, is responding and thinking about this situation and the way it's maybe looking forward in the policy circles?
Sure, and thank you very much for both the question and more widely the invitation to speak with so many people who seem to be more interested in this on a Saturday evening than the Oktoberfest or any other thing going on in Vienna, and there's plenty. I would say, you know, the refugee crisis in perhaps a bit of a paradoxical way further erases the borders that we see now being called into question by Putin, by others like him. And the reason I say this is that because since you took Romania as sort of a kind of a central point to frame my perspective, I will say that my country sought membership into the EU and NATO because we were feeding ourselves this illusion that once we were in, we would be sheltered from all of the conflictual developments that we felt this region that we belonged to was kind of doomed to undergo historically. It's a region that still hasn't solved its multiple interethnic tensions. It's a region whose borders have often been recalled into discussion. Russia has been felt as a permanent aggressor. We feared that sooner or later what's happening these days was going to happen. So I think we didn't just seek to go back to the bosom of the West in a cultural identity kind of way, but also from a very strict security point of view, I think we imagined a wall being raised at the border of Romania, kind of keeping the everything east of Eden really to the east, farther east. What we're seeing now is this east is really coming back with a bang, so to speak. It's coming and invading, let's say, a space that we thought would be very different from what was going on the other side of the wall. And in one way, it's actually good. I think it's a wake-up call to reality. I think it's, and we are realizing that this was really literally just kilometers away. We've never been sheltered. So this is, I think, the good thing, and I think it's the amazing thing is that Romania and Ukraine have traditionally been difficult neighbors. We've had territorial disputes, we have minorities on each other's territory, and things are not necessarily rosy all the time. And I think now relations between the two countries at a people-to-people level have kind of jump-started in a way that no politician, no government ever was able to do. But at the same time, we see the prospect of refugees potentially being weaponized themselves in the future. Russia has been instrumentalizing all sorts of domestic tensions against ourselves through influence operations, disinformation, and so on and so forth. We do expect that they're going to sooner or later make use of the presence of refugees to potentially light some sparks of tension there. We also fear that we've never been prepared, even not just in a practical way, but mentally, for a nation that would now be much more diverse, that would need to be much more open to a culture that is different, and that could spark tension as well. I think, on the whole, essentially, I really think it is so lucky that this meeting of cultures is taking place. It is so unfortunate that it is happening under such circumstances that present every risk of actually turning this into a rather ugly, you know, and murky period of time, and rather than, you know, the nice meeting of cultures that it could be.
I think it's very important to repeat the fact that actually the European Union made a really geopolitical and geostrategic decision when it took Romania and Bulgaria as members, and NATO, of course, into the EU in 2007, because as it was much debated at that time, many people said these countries are not ready, there's corruption, the rule of law is not there. But I think with hindsight, we can only imagine with fear what it would have meant had Romania and Bulgaria not been members of the EU and NATO. And I liken it to buying an insurance policy, as you just said, to go into a club that somehow gives you a certain element of certainty in an age of uncertainty. Can you just, as a follow-up question, is there unanimity in the political sphere in Romania on the attitude towards what is happening with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, or do you have pro-Russian sort of elements and sources? We saw a recent public opinion poll in Slovakia, which was stunning because more than 50% said they wished that Russia would win the war.
Yeah, no, I think Romania looks quite different in that sense. The war has really turned everything very into black and white. And I think, you know, we've always been, even unfortunately, I could say, very kind of organically anti-Russian. And when I say anti-Russian, I mean against everything that Putin's Russia represents as a political system, as a repressive country. And I think we've always seen Russia as an aggressor. So it's quasi-unanimous, the support for refugees, support for Ukraine, dissatisfaction with the fact that the Romanian government, the population feels isn't doing enough and should be doing more. That being said, things are very tricky, as they are throughout the EU. Ask people if they support Ukraine, they will almost unanimously say yes. Ask them if, you know, or especially ask them 2 or 3 months from now, in the middle of winter or toward the end of winter, if Ukraine should perhaps sacrifice these territories faster for our sake, for the sake of all of its neighbors and so on and so forth, and they will say yes again, because where I think Romania differs very much from Poland, for example, is that the Poles, like Romania, have always thought Russia would act aggressively one day. And so they said, so we'd better get ready. And they boosted their defenses and so on and so forth. In Romania, the attitude was actually, we know Russia is going to be an aggressor one day, so we need to do everything to avoid a confrontation, because if a confrontation with Russia happens, we stand no chance of winning. And so the strategy on the Romanian side was try to boost the strategic partnership with the US, try to host NATO troops on our territory, and so on and so forth, so that we could have the guarantee that an attack against Romania would trigger an automatic response from NATO, not just from Romania. But now, especially with Putin flagging the nuclear threat and so on and so forth, I think increasingly the more the war drags on, the more people are afraid. And so it's very easy for them to say, we absolutely support Ukraine, but we think in the bigger picture, this is always a power play between great powers. There's going to be a deal at the end of the day between Washington and Moscow, between Brussels, Berlin, Paris, London, and Moscow. So why don't the Ukrainians just understand that they're doomed in this, and so, you know, give up that piece of territory and we can have peace sooner rather than later. So I think it's really tricky.
Okay, Tom, turning to you. You are one of the foremost experts on the Caucasus, and you've written a number of books, Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace to War. This Russian invasion has obviously triggered a number of dynamics in this region. We've had a renewed fight between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We've had this conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. I'll come back more specifically to Georgia a little later, but can you say something about what this means for this East of Eden territory and how you see the dynamics evolving?
Sure, and also just let me say how glad I am to be with you today as well. Sure, I mean, it's remarkable how quickly I think the antennae of Russia's neighbors prick up when they see Russian weakness. You know, I was in Russia in the 1990s, covered the war in Chechnya, and that was a point when the countries of the South Caucasus made big strides forward because they sensed Russian weakness and started to move on you know, oil and gas deals with the West and so on. And I think we're seeing another moment of Russian weakness. As we know, there's Russia engineered a peacekeeping force at the end of the Azerbaijan-Armenia War of 2020, and that's sitting there. But Azerbaijan, I think, sensing Russian weakness, made this move already inside Armenian territory 2 weeks ago, a kind of limited military incursion. When I say limited, about 300 people died, so it wasn't that limited. It was a bloody couple of days. And so Azerbaijan trying to press its advantage against Armenia, which is obviously, although a democratic country, relies on Russia as its security patron. And as you mentioned in Central Asia, a similar dynamic, Tajikistan with cross-border incursions against Kyrgyzstan. So this is, the Russian policeman is busy, preoccupied with Ukraine, and other countries are acting, not necessarily in a positive way. I mean, it does leave the question of a security vacuum. Can anyone else step in? The OSCE has traditionally dealt in these areas, but the OSCE, doesn't have that kind of enforcement capacity, as we know. So big questions, and then, and big questions again over Georgia, a country which has a pro-Western, generally pro-Western orientation, but for the last 10 years has had a government which has been extremely cautious and also trying to balance a bit with Russia, and now finding that strategy doesn't work for them anymore.
What is the reason that Georgia is the odd person out in this trio?
Yes, I mean, I was thinking...
Because, as you said, they're very pro-European, they have a strong civil society. I mean,
I think back, I think to the sound, when I think about Georgia, I think to that song and the Sound of Music, what do you do with a problem like Georgia? It's a country with so much potential, a country which, since 1992, since former Soviet Foreign Minister, Shevardnadze returned to Georgia, has had basically a pro-Western orientation, but which also, also had two extremely debilitating wars in the early 1990s, in which the Georgian side, we have to, say, played its role in starting those wars. Russia certainly was a malign factor, but the Georgians, and I think many Georgians would acknowledge that now. Georgian nationalism was a big factor in those conflicts. So hampered by those conflicts, hampered by geography, extreme poverty, and has spent the last 3 decades slowly hauling itself out of this kind of post-Soviet morass, but is also a country which is now governed by a very eccentric ruling party, probably the most eccentric in the wider Europe, Georgian Dream, run by this reclusive billionaire, Bidzina Ivanishvili, the founder of that party, who's kind of performed acts of state capture on Georgia, unfortunately, so a lot of crony capitalism there, and yet a very vibrant civil society, a very educated elite in Tbilisi. So with all those factors, it's not really surprising that it's a more difficult case, and that the EU was putting major conditionality, 12 points of conditionality on Georgia to become a candidate status. And now, putting the onus back on Georgians to get their own house in order so as to get candidate status.
What is the likelihood that they can meet at least a third of those 12 points?
Yeah, well, this is obviously the big issue.
Because that's what the Europeans often say quietly to you, if they met only 4 or 5.
They've extended the deadline till the autumn of next year, but I'm not optimistic. I think this is a government which is very inward-looking, which lacks much strategic vision about wanting to stay in power, which has been quite aggressive towards the EU in recent years. Increasingly with the years, it didn't start that way. And therefore, I think one which does not want to give up its hold on power, things like control of the judiciary, de-oligarchization, as the EU puts it. And therefore, I'm afraid that it's not going to, meet the EU scorecard next year, and there will probably seem quite a severe political crisis in Georgia as a result.
Okay. Well, now let me ask you about Moldova. This is a country that speaks Romanian, that is a sisterly country to Romania, that has now clearly opted after a series of elections for the Western path, that has this thorn in its backside called Transnistria. How do you see, and it is of course the poorest country in Europe, so many challenges with a kind of vibrant political elite. How do you see them evolving, and what is Romania doing to help them on this path?
I think they're facing a difficult path ahead. One of the main reasons is internal. There's very strong will from this government to move forward, but there is enormous pressure, and everything pretty much depends on how and if they survive this winter. Because Moldova is facing tremendous financial challenges, development challenges, and with inflation skyrocketing, with any sort of energy crisis on the horizon, if there's any potential food shortage or anything of the sort, this government is already under pressure. It might come under even stronger pressure. So let's see first if the government manages to hold on. And that's going to depend very much on assistance from other countries. It's not something that Moldova can weather by itself. It's going to depend a lot on whether Western partners continue to help the country. The other obstacle has to do a lot with the EU. And I think that's where we're going to see the potential difference between the quick reaction from the EU in opening the doors to Ukraine and Moldova, and the question of, are we as the EU going to hold on to our promise moving forward? Was this serious on our side? Did we really, have we just made a gesture which was mostly geopolitical, and it was a reaction to the crisis, and we kind of thought, and we'll deal with the rest later, we'll think about it when we get there, or have we really embarked on a process to help Moldova transform? Because Moldova, much like Georgia, I think, in a way, and Ukraine is going to be in a very similar situation, they all embody the pain of transformation, of democratic transformation. On the one hand, it's the geopolitical option, and the EU is a geopolitical option for all of these countries in this global competition which opposes the Western Alliance, the US and the EU and NATO as well for them, two mostly revisionist powers. But then the EU is also a system of values and a system of governance. And these countries find it much easier to relate to the EU geopolitically, and the EU finds it much easier, as you pointed out with Romania and Bulgaria, to make geopolitical options every now and then, especially when we have to deal with a crisis. It is much more difficult on the front of transforming a country to look and feel much more like let's say, the EU average, or what the EU ideally embodies for all of them, because in all honesty, many of us within the European Union fall short of EU standards, and we only need to look at the recent Italian election, not necessarily in Central Eastern Europe. So while these countries might be making the geopolitical option and the EU might be making the geopolitical option, I'm not sure that it's going to be as easy for either side to really learn and be serious about coming together, about learning to be more like each other. And I was just a couple of days ago speaking to the ambassador of the Netherlands in Romania, and he was saying, you know, at the risk of sounding too Calvinist, they need to do their homework. And even you, I mean, in Romania, you need to do your homework if you want to get into Schengen, or if you want the mechanism for cooperation and verification on justice lifted. And I said, that is absolutely true. That is true. Of course, membership to the club means you need to observe the rules of the club. But for Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, just as for the Western Balkans, if we're going to bark at each other from two sides of the fence, you know, one side says, do your homework, the other side says, you don't understand, you know, the politicians have no reason to give up on control of power unless they're given some incentives, and unless, and you know, people are not incentivized to go through all the sacrifices and all the painful transformation involved in being more European, unless you have the reward, the big reward at the end of the road, and the intermediate rewards that say, you're doing well, keep on doing that. So unless we learn how to do that, and I'm not sure the EU is serious about it, then these countries are faced with a lot of disappointment in the near future, and potentially, you know, losing their enthusiasm for the whole process.
Well, indeed, I mean, this is part of the uncertainty that we're facing, given that these two countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and as we said, potentially Georgia, have joined the club of the Western Balkan countries who have been in this process, some for more than well over 10 years, some less, and somehow the goal is not in sight. And of course, privately, one hears that many countries in the Union don't think there will ever be another enlargement, and these kind of rumors trickle down to these countries and say, why should we do the homework? And I, like you say, and I come from a country that's a candidate called Serbia, I always say that the homework is on our side. But again, it takes two to tango. If there's no quote-unquote reward, I don't think it's a good word, but anyway, if there's not something coming from the other side, then there is not this incentive. So in fact, we now have a big club of countries because remember, Ukraine is 44 million people. The Western Balkans altogether now, with the declined population, is about 16 million. So we're talking, the Western Balkans is practically a third of Ukraine's population. So one has to have these numbers in mind to understand what the volume of the challenge is. But Tom, I'd like to ask you, OANA has already, in a sense, begun to address this question. Again, the decision to make them candidates is extremely important. It sends a clear message to all of us, to Russia, to ourselves, to other candidate countries. But in the recent visit of Ursula von der Leyen to Kyiv after her State of the Union speech, there was talk about, you know, giving Ukraine the possibility, or rather the demand from Ukraine to join elements of the single market, the four freedoms, etc. Do you see this as a realistic perspective to have some of these elements? Because my personal view is, if, as OANA just said, if there's nothing concrete coming down the line, then we're really into a sort of morass of uncertainty where, again, the Russias of this world can have their fingers meddling.
Sure. I mean, I think there has to be some kind of intermediate steps on the way, and maybe this is a discussion in our fellowship we've been having all this this month about, full membership should definitely be on the table. But I mean, we all know how poor these countries are. Look at their agriculture, and also, I wouldn't necessarily wish on Georgian and Moldovan farmers to join the common agricultural policy. I think, it could kill off those small farms. So I think that, sure, full membership should still be on the table, but I think some kind of intermediate steps where you're giving some of the freedoms, better access to the single market, and so on, is surely keeps them on the road, pushes back the cynics, keeps the momentum in the European direction. Georgia. Was looking at the polls this morning. Consistently, it's 70, 75, 80% of the population is in favour of the EU, and that's a momentum that needs to be capitalised on. That's actually higher than a lot of EU countries themselves. So, and obviously they understand this in different ways. The most popular answer is because of the economy, obviously, or they see the EU as a protection. As we know, Russia and Vladimir Putin in particular has been the biggest driver of EU enlargement and NATO enlargement, as we know. But there has to be no complacency, creativity about giving intermediate steps, rewards to these countries.
No, I think that's absolutely fundamental, and obviously there's a lot going on in the European Union itself. I was part of a brainstorming yesterday organized by the French Foreign Ministry, where there was really repeatedly the French counterpart said, France really understand that enlargement is important. There's been a shift over the past 2 years, principally because of the geopolitical moment, but previously, prior to the Russian invasion, the understanding that Russia, China, etc., were meddling really very much in the Western Balkans, and that the EU had to get a grip on things and get involved geoeconomically, I would say, a lot. But then, there's this intermediary thing, and, we can discuss this to death. What is the European political community, which will meet in Prague in 5 days' time, where all countries that we're talking about, including Turkey and others, will discuss, as they kept repeatedly saying, on an equal footing. It is not the European Union, it's something else. They say it's not counter to enlargement, but a support to enlargement. Obviously, there's an understanding that things need to be done. So this should not be a talking shop, obviously. We'll see what comes out of it. They said there will be a focus on security and energy. Energy clearly is one of the fundamentals of what's happened. Europe will wean itself off Russian fossil fuels. Romania is one of the lucky countries that has its own sources of energy, but others like Moldova or like my country are still dependent very much on this. And so I think that's maybe an area, what do you think, where the European Union could do more to support all of these countries that we're talking about?
No, absolutely, and I think there's great potential for the European political community. If this is serious, then I think it is fundamental, at least now with the war in Ukraine, to acknowledge precisely this, that we are not yet, all of us in Europe, adhering to the exact same values, to the exact same standards. We're not all perfectly alike. We're still moving in that direction, and again, I think this is, if you look at all the far right, the populist and nationalist movements throughout Europe, this is something that's happening in the West as much as in the East of Europe. We're all kind of renegotiating with ourselves what those common standards are, what our common identity is. But in the meantime, the simple fact that we are all Europeans and we clearly adhere to a completely different system of values than Vladimir Putin, for instance, that is something that under the current circumstances is fundamental. It's not something we can waste. And I think the European Union would do well to to come up with a design for the European political community that allows us to work together already on these strategic issues, and energy independence is definitely one of these issues. I think better infrastructure, better interdependence in terms of trade and supply chains, strengthening our common resilience, all of these things, climate policies, that they're all things that don't have borders, and we would benefit enormously from working with the Western Balkans, with Ukraine, with the others. It's not just a one-way street. And I think it's really time that we came up with a definite answer to the question: do we in the EU see this as a sort of a prize, EU membership, that's given to the best and brightest, and we don't really care about it? We don't necessarily think it's in our advantage. Whether they join or not is none of our business. You know, we've set the rules. If they meet them, fine. If they don't, who cares? Or do we really feel, looking at what's happening in Russia, at what's happening in China, that this is to our advantage too? So it does matter if the countries around us want to join or not. And it does matter if we lose countries, as we are preparing to lose Serbia, I think, and because we have neglected precisely this kind of dynamics. And then we invest in this relationship too. We don't just stand back and say, you do your homework, and then we'll see. So I think there's tremendous potential for this. I have a hard time taking the French seriously, because I don't think this is the way you do things in the EU, and it doesn't show that you have a strategy. If you come and say, I have an idea for a framework, I'm just not going to tell you anything about it, and they say, we don't want to own it, we want to share this with the others in the EU. But you need to share an idea, you need to share the substance, you need to propose something. You cannot just say, I propose this empty framework, and then you put something inside, because that kind of...
We'll see what comes out of Prague on the 6th and 7th of October, but I'll open it up to the audience now for questions. Please do raise your hands, and I think I can't see any hands yet. Please, here. And do introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Udo Jans, formerly with the UNHCR, the refugee agency in the Western Balkans and the wider Eastern Europe. Education is something that I didn't hear at all. I find it frankly demeaning for a lot of young people who wish nothing more than to study abroad and bring that experience back home, if they have to queue in front of the embassies for miles on end and wait for a visa that they may get or may not get. So I would hope that education can be included in that agenda. Thank you.
Quick response from our two speakers on that.
You know, visa liberalization is one of the big achievements of the last few years, and Erasmus+. So I think there's positive developments in that sphere with these countries. So it's not all bad news.
And I mean, frankly, in this day and age, I think freedom of travel should be counted as a basic human right, essentially. I think it should be the default option. But as the EU doesn't seem prepared to give visa liberalization to Kosovo, then I'm very circumspect when it comes to whether they're going to be willing to do anything serious about this. But I fully agree with you. I mean, and education is actually perhaps the strongest transformative weapon, and free travel is the strongest transformative tool. So,
indeed, I'm glad you mentioned the Kosovo visa liberalization issue. It is, I'll use a very strong word. I think it's a scandal that this has not happened. Moldova has visa-free travel. Mm-hmm. Ukraine has visa-free travel. Even Venezuela has visa-free travel with Europe, but not this place called Kosovo, which has 1.7 million people. But there are signs from the Czech presidency of the European Union over the past few weeks that it seems that there's an alignment to achieve this visa-free travel by the end of the year. Any more questions? Yes, please. Here, first row.
Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. Actually, it's said how far is the EU willing to go? Now the problem seems rather sometimes with the members. When we think at Macedonia, now North Macedonia, first the French and Dutch were against, now Bulgaria for some very strange reasons having nothing to do with the EU actually. So how could be the impact of the current situation of the invasion in Ukraine sort of help that members come to terms and are in favor of enlargement? Thank you.
Tom?
I'm not really, I don't think I have anything useful to say on that, particularly when it comes to Macedonia.
Well, let me say something then, which is that the one thing that's mind-boggling when it comes to some of the EU member states that have consistently opposed the whole dynamics of enlargement, whether it was opening negotiations with various countries or visa liberalization and so on and so forth, is that I do understand the reservations when it comes to, say, closing the negotiations, closing chapters even, and then actually receiving countries as members, because I do understand that the EU is consumed with its own internal crisis, and we don't know how we're going to be dealing with this and so on and so forth. I don't understand how can we not open negotiations? How can we not advance the process? Because it is only if we have an ongoing process that we can actually have leverage on these countries, even from a very self-interested EU perspective. Unless you have the process, unless you have the framework for negotiation, even for the sticks and carrots, then you deprive yourself of a very strong instrument. And that's what we're doing. I mean, we're shooting ourselves in the foot over and over again. And a few weeks ago, a few months ago, I really hoped that the shock of war in Europe would be strong enough that we would finally put substance to what we call a geopolitical commission, the geopolitical approach, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, I see that the difference between the US and the UK on the one hand and the EU on the other hand is that we are not very bad at reacting to crisis. We seem to continue to be bad at learning from them because we fail to develop strategies. And I think it shows that, we've been doing some very good things since the beginning of the war in helping Ukraine, in advancing energy independence from Russia, and so on and so forth. But we're just improvising as we go along. These are quick fixes. This is a reaction to crisis. It's not part of a strategy, whereas I do see the US and the UK, when it comes to Central Eastern Europe and enlargement, I do see them feeding their reaction to crisis into pre-existing strategies and pre-existing understanding of the security dynamics. And I'm frustrated with the fact that the EU seems to continue to fail to do that.
Yeah, there's much to be said. I must add that referring to North Macedonia, that one of the biggest mistakes recently was when France blocked North Macedonia after a truly historic agreement with Greece. After Greece, for 27 years, blocked a country still then called Macedonia, when they found this historic agreement that instead of pushing it and pulling it forward after the achievement, it blocked it, which allowed then for Bulgaria. But I have two questions here, first here and then over there. Let's take these two questions together.
Thank you. Questions for both speakers. Can you tell us what's going on in Moldova? How is the Sandu government dealing with the situation and the dynamics across the river right now?
Okay, and one more question behind you over there. Yeah, just pass it behind.
Yeah, Thank you very much. Yeah, I can sort of sense the frustration from all three of you about the sort of complications of becoming a member or even considered as a candidate for the European Union. And one also knows about the hesitations of some member states, for good reason, because it's proven quite difficult for some countries which are now members to be fully absorbed into the system. And so I was just wondering if there's some kind of middle ground that might provide the carrot to give people a sense that they're members of some club, but not the sort of maximalist club that we currently have. Freedom of movement, various elements that could form something that would be worthwhile exploring.
Okay, who wants to start?
Well, the Sandu government.
Okay.
I'll have a few things to say about
Sandu
Transnistria.
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, I think that the main challenge is administrative capacity. So there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of alignment with Western partners. It is very hard for Moldova to actually deliver on policies and on implementation, simply because, among other things, it's a country that's been depleted of its population, and because of the backsliding over years, when they had a pro-Russian government, a lot of people have emigrated. So now there's a crisis of deprofessionalization, and the EU accession process can be extremely, extremely demanding from that point of view. When it comes to the socioeconomic situation, I honestly think right now they're doing the best they can under circumstances where they have very few domestic resources to actually do much. So it's very much essentially keeping in line with the demands of international donors. So it's, it's a government that's performing well, but on the other hand, it's performing well because it's following guidelines set by international donors, because that's the only way that, that's the only option that's available to Moldova right now. I'm not sure what you mean by, when you say the dynamics across the river, do you mean the River Prut with Romania?
No.
Oh, okay. With Transnistria. Well, I think they've averted the worst possible outcome, which would have been Russia using Transnistria for a potential invasion of Moldova. I think that is not a likely scenario at this point. It would be very difficult for the Russians to do that both tactically and strategically. I think in Transnistria, actually, there's very little desire from an otherwise pro-Russian government to join the war, to join Russia's war. They want to stay out of it. They want to have nothing to do with it. So I think at this point, things remain in the unfortunate state that they are, which is, well, a separatist frozen conflict, but at least they're not getting worse.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of words on. I mean, I followed Transnistria over the years. I entirely agree. I think it's one of the bits of good news of this conflict is that all those contacts over the years between Chisinau and Tiraspol of working all the economic integration, and surprisingly, it's almost the Ukrainians and the Russians, or people in Kiev and Moscow, who've been trying to kind of talk up the war, and in Chisinau and Tiraspol saying, no, actually, we don't want this, we're going to lie low. And fortunately, we never had the scenario with the Russians in Odessa looking over the horizon at Transnistria. Long may that continue. And I'd just also remind you that Transnistria joins the Moldovan DCFTA, the free trade area, which is so that Transnistria actually has economic reasons for Moldova to move towards EU membership as well.
And this has really been a game changer. I mean, the fact that the EU extended the DCFTA to Transnistria provided a very strong incentive for Transnistria not to want any more trouble.
Which is another example of, if you bring us to the table, there's more chance that we will start behaving in a kind of, rules-based way or values-based way. Tom, was it you who told me that, in fact, the number of Russian soldiers in Transnistria was very small in this battalion of 1,700
soldiers?
There's
the headline figure is about 1,500 500, but most of those, because there's been so little rotation over the years, most of those are locals. So less than 100 are actually from Russia itself, which is another stabilizing factor. Compare that to about 7,000 Russians in Abkhazia, for example.
And an interesting fact, in fact. We have, okay, I see 2 questions over there.
I think there was also the question about the middle ground.
The middle ground, okay, we'll come back to that. Let's see these 2 questions. It's a very important question, very important. Yes.
Doug Wake, former U.S. diplomat and OSCE official, but not speaking in those capacities. Just do wonder a little bit, though, if speakers want to say anything about the transatlantic dimension of this, because you have mentioned a little bit the role of the U.S., but unlike the first countries which joined both the EU and NATO, where the U.S. largely played a sort of supportive security role, and the EU was very much the economic support and the big packages that came in. In the case of the 3 countries you're talking about now, the U.S. was much more involved in early years than the European Union in working with Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, when none of them seemed to be on the path toward the EU. Now, if the EU is taking on a more geopolitical role, should the U.S. somehow also be more engaged in some of the other transformation issues? And is there some basis for renegotiating the roles in the future of North America and Europe in the integration of countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia?
Okay, and just next to you or behind you.
Thank you. I'm Rafał Zawisza from Poland, an IWM fellow at the moment. And I would like to, I've recently read an article about Romanian attitude towards the war, and it was sounding quite cynical in a sense that Romania could be afraid of strong neighbors like Poland and Ukraine. So do you think that it can be reversed in a sense that instead of going into this potential direction, Romania should actually collaborate closely with Poland and create something that they wanted to create before 1939, at the moment when the Romanian king was invited to Windhoek to talk about an alliance, and those 2 countries should rather become strong advocates of Ukraine being immediately, as soon as possible, the member states of the EU.
Okay, so we have the intermediary steps, the transatlantic, and you want to take this last question first?
Whichever order, really. I would say, yeah, absolutely. This is something that's going on already. For years now, Romania and Poland have had very strong cooperation, especially on security. Also, there's a Romania, Poland, Turkey trilateral. All of this is becoming increasingly important as we find that we really need to step up to the plate because things are going to be unstable in our region for a long time to come. And while NATO can provide, of course, a lot of capacity that we don't have, it's very much up to the regional countries to develop their own capabilities. Indeed, Romania fears, I would say we fear Ukraine more than Poland. I don't think we have any such reservations when it comes to Poland. I think we are still suspicious of Ukraine as a potentially difficult neighbor, but that only influences the fact that it's harder to work together because we don't have a history of working together. It doesn't mean that strategically it is not widely understood in Romania that exactly Poland, I think, would be in the lead, but I think Romania would work closely with Poland to try and keep Ukraine as close to the EU and NATO members as possible. When it comes to the US, I think there is nothing there that needs to change. I think the US has been involved in multiple ways in the democratic transformation of the region, but it shouldn't get involved more. I think the EU should do that. It's not a function of the US subsequently renegotiating its own involvement. And to be honest, If it gets too much involved at some point, you might see backlash. So it's really a matter for the EU. And when it comes to the intermediate level, I will just say, yes, absolutely. I was hoping that's what the European political community was all about, providing some sort of intermediary steps or club or whatever you want. There are multiple proposals as to staged accession process and so on. So all of these things, I think, can give substance to a process which is otherwise extremely time-consuming, extremely frustrating on both sides, and with a lot of potential to fail.
Sure. I mean, I would definitely agree with everything OANA said. I mean, clearly, I think the US has its hands full in so many places that to be a partner of the EU is definitely the right position to be taking in these countries. And, US remains the security patron by default of Europe, and that's an important enough job as it is. Imagined, what it would be like if the US was not taking its current position of military support to Ukraine. And I would recommend on this issue of EU enlargement, I'd recommend that the podcast that our colleague Ivan Krastev talked to Gideon Rackmond of FT earlier this week, and many issues, but I think Ivan put it very well. He said, maybe we should be rethinking the whole term enlargement of opening and closing chapters. This is a whole moment to reconstitute the whole European project in a very different way. It's a whole new mental shift is required. Now we're not just talking about traditional enlargement. We're talking about something quite different.
No, absolutely. I think, as we've said, thanks to Putin, in fact, all this thing, this whole question has been accelerated. I mean, remember, if we do remember, there was something called the Eastern Partnership that was launched by the European Union for all of these countries. Suddenly, something that nobody in their right mind would have thought possible, Ukraine and Moldova are full candidates for full membership. So, again, speaking from a candidate country, that is, as OANA says, we're all European people who have been to Tbilisi, Chisinau, not to mention Ukrainian cities. These are very European cities. I mean, when you're sitting in a cafe in Chisinau, or you don't see really a difference from countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So either Europe gets its act together and starts moving more quickly, and yes, there needs to be a change in the European way of doing things. The famous deepening versus widening. We probably need to go to qualified majority voting, not to get into the Talmudic debates about that. But I still feel that if Europe is not bolder in its decisions, and it has been bolder, we need to acknowledge that in a full. We won't be seeing actually what we desire, and thus the intermediate steps need to be bolder as well. Bring us to the table. And there has been example. The Western Balkan countries were fully at the table during the migration crisis in 2014-15. Without them, there would not have been a solution to it. So they were, invited. They were sitting in Brussels and Berlin and other places with these countries. So that's just an example. Why not have these countries at the table on cyber, on energy, on a variety of security issues without them being full members or having voting rights or the rest? Again, I think it's kind of the inclusive approach rather than the teacher sending you to the corner because you haven't done your homework. We have come to the end of our session. I remind you that we have a lecture by Catherine Belton, or rather a discussion with Tessa Shishkovich at the Rathaus. But before that, a great thanks to both OANA and Tom for their excellent...
Thank you, Ivan.